Apache warrior saved a white schoolteacher. Unaware she once lived among his people, an Apache warrior saved a white schoolteacher from certain death. But when she whispered thank you in his own language, he realized this stranger might hold the key to his most painful childhood memory. The chalk dust hung in the desert air like prayer smoke, drifting through the single window of Socorro's schoolhouse as Sarah McKenna traced letters on the warm blackboard. 23 children sat in crooked rows, their faces dusty from the morning walk, eyes heavy with the weight of frontier life that aged them beyond their years. Outside, the New Mexico sun beat down mercilessly on adobe walls, and somewhere in the distance, a hawk circled the endless expanse of mesa and sage. A is for apple, Sarah said softly, her voice carrying the gentle authority that came from 3 years of teaching children whose fathers might not return from cattle drives, whose mothers aged 10 years for everyone. She wrote the letter with careful strokes, the chalk clicking against the board like beetles against glass. 8-year-old Lucy Martinez raised her dirt-stained hand. Miss McKenna, my pa says there ain't going to be apples this year. Says the Apache burned the orchards down in Mesilla. Sarah's hand paused mid-stroke, the chalk hovering like a white bird against the dark slate. Something flickered across her face, too quick for the children to catch, but heavy as storm clouds. Sometimes, she said quietly, we must speak of things that are not yet real, Lucy. Sometimes we must believe in apples before we can taste. The children nodded with the solemnity that came from understanding hunger, from knowing that belief was sometimes all that stood between them and the endless desert that stretched beyond their small world of letters and numbers and hope. But the lesson was not meant to finish. The sound came first, hoofbeats like thunder rolling across the desert floor, followed by whoops and hollers that made every child freeze in their seats. Sarah's blood turned to ice water as she recognized the sound. Not Apache war cries. She knew those intimately, though she could never explain why. These were different, cruder. White men pretending at wildness. Under your desks, she whispered, and the children moved like shadows, their small bodies folding into hiding spots they had practiced too many times before. The door exploded inward with a crash of splintered wood and twisted metal. 3 men filled the doorway, their faces hidden behind bandanas, their eyes wild with whiskey and violence. The leader, a tall man with silver spurs that jangled like wind chimes, surveyed the room with the lazy confidence of a coyote in a henhouse. Well, he drawled, his voice thick with something darker than desert dust. Look what we found, boys. A little schoolmarm and her baby birds. Sarah stood perfectly still, her hand still holding the chalk, her dress dusty from the day's teaching. But something had changed in her posture, something the men couldn't see but would have recognized if they'd spent time among the Apache. She stood like a woman who had learned to read the wind for danger, who had learned that stillness was sometimes the difference between life and death. Take what you want, she said quietly, but leave the children be. The second man, shorter and barrel-chested, laughed like breaking glass. Oh, we ain't here for what you got, teacher lady. We're here for what you are. He stepped closer, and Sarah could smell the rancid sweat of the man who lived rough and died rougher. See, there's folks in Santa Fe who pay good money for women who can teach. And you, he reached out to touch her face with a hand that had known too much violence. The arrow took him through the shoulder before his fingers could find her cheek. It came, but the Apache warrior was already inside. He moved like desert wind made flesh, silent, swift, inevitable. His skin was the color of red canyon stone, his black hair long and bound with leather strips. He wore no war paint, no feathers, just the simple clothing of a man who lived between worlds, comfortable in neither. But his eyes held the weight of mountains, the patience of stone, and something else that Sarah McKenna recognized even as her heart hammered against her ribs. The leader's gun cleared its holster, but the warrior's war club caught his wrist with the sound of breaking kindling. The pistol clattered to the floor, and the man followed it, clutching his shattered arm and making sounds like a wounded coyote. The third bandit ran. Smart man. In the sudden silence that followed, Sarah and the warrior stood facing each other across the dusty schoolroom. The children remained hidden, but Sarah could feel their eyes watching from the shadows beneath desks and behind chairs. The afternoon sun slanted through the window, illuminating the chalk dust that still hung in the air like suspended time. "Thank you," Sarah said softly. But she didn't say it in English. The words came out in perfect Chiricahua Apache, spoken with the fluid grace of someone who had learned the language not from books, but from sitting beside fires under star-swept skies, from sharing meals and stories, and the quiet communion that comes from being family. The warrior went absolutely still. His dark eyes searched her face with an intensity that made the desert sun seem cool. Sarah felt her heart hammering as she realized what she had done, how the words had slipped from her lips like birds released from a cage she had kept locked for 15 years. "You speak the old words," he said in English, but his voice carried the rhythm of his native tongue, the musical cadence that had once been as familiar to her as her own heartbeat. Sarah began, then stopped. How could she explain? How could she tell this stranger that his language lived in her dreams, that Apache words whispered themselves through her thoughts when the wind was right? How could she tell him that sometimes, teaching these settler children their letters, she wanted to teach them different words, words for courage and honor and the way morning light looked on sacred mountains? "You move like the desert people," the warrior said quietly, and there was something in his voice, confusion, recognition, the sound of a man grasping for a memory that danced just beyond reach. "But your skin," Sarah touched her own face unconsciously. Pale, always pale, despite years under the southwestern sun. The skin that had marked her as other, as different, as someone who belonged neither to the world of her birth nor the world of her heart. "Miss McKenna?" Lucy Martinez's small voice came from beneath her desk. "Are the bad men gone?" The spell broke. Sarah knelt beside the children, checking for injuries, offering comfort with the gentle authority that came from 3 years of being their sanctuary in a hard world. The warrior watched her, and she could feel his eyes on her like desert sun, warming and dangerous at the same time. When she looked up again, he was gone. But on her desk, beside the broken chalk and scattered papers, lay a single eagle feather, white-tipped and perfect, the kind used in ceremonies she remembered but could never speak of. The kind that meant protection, meant blessing, meant someone had seen her worth even when the world saw only her difference. Sarah McKenna picked up the feather with trembling fingers, and for just a moment, she allowed herself to remember what it felt like to be someone else entirely. Someone who belonged, someone who had a name that meant little star, and a place beside fires that burned in her memory like distant constellation. Outside, the desert wind whispered secrets through the sage, carrying the sound of hoofbeats fading into the endless expanse of mesa and sky. But Sarah knew, with the certainty that comes from dreams and half-remembered songs, that this was not an ending. It was the first note of a melody she had been waiting 15 years to hear again. As the last echo of hoofbeats faded into the desert silence, Sarah stood holding the eagle feather, her heart racing with recognition she couldn't quite name. Somewhere in the depths of her memory, a voice whispered in Apache, a child's voice calling across the years, but the words remained just beyond her reach, like stars visible only in peripheral vision. Nailnish had not meant to return to the ridge overlooking Socorro. Yet for 7 sunrises, he found himself there at dawn, watching smoke rise from the settlement's chimneys like prayers ascending to the morning sky. From his vantage point among the pinyon pines, he could see the schoolhouse clearly, its adobe walls the color of dry blood, its single window catching the early light like a watching eye. He told himself he was scouting for his band, keeping watch on the white settlement that pressed ever closer to Apache sacred grounds. He told himself many things, but they all fell away when the schoolteacher emerged each morning to tend her small garden behind the building. Her name was Sarah McKenna. He had learned this from listening to the wind carry voices across the desert. But watching her move among the plants she grew, Nailnish wondered if she had ever carried another name. Her hands knew desert flora with the certainty of his own people. She coaxed life from reluctant soil, whispered to struggling seedlings, and harvested herbs with the reverence of someone who understood that all growing things were sacred gifts. This morning, she knelt among rows of corn and beans, her pale dress dusty from the earth, her sun-bleached hair escaping its careful pins to fall across her face like corn silk. But it was the sound that made his breath catch, a melody, soft and wordless, that drifted up from the garden like smoke from ceremonial fires. Nailnish knew that song. His grandmother had sung it to him when the world was young and endless, when Apache children played in mountain streams that ran clear and cold. It was a lullaby for planting time, a prayer to encourage seeds to trust the darkness of soil before reaching toward light. How did a white woman know the songs of his grandmother's mother? The sound of approaching horses drew his attention away from the impossible melody. 3 riders approached from the south, Apache, by their posture and the way they moved with their mounts, as if horse and rider shared one spirit. Nailnish recognized them, young warriors from his cousin's band, their faces painted for raiding, their eyes hard with the fury that came from watching their people driven from ancestral lands. Below, the settlement had noticed the riders too. Doors slammed shut, windows were barricaded, and men emerged with rifles that gleamed in the morning sun. The familiar dance of fear and violence began, each side reading threat in the other's movement, each prepared to spill blood over misunderstandings that had been building for generations. But Sarah McKenna did not run. She stood in her garden, dirt still clinging to her hands, and watched the Apache warriors with eyes that held no fear, only a deep, inexplicable sadness. When a lead rider called out in Chiricahua, demanding food and safe passage, the other settlers looked to each other with a blank incomprehension of people who heard only meaningless sounds. Sarah McKenna answered. The words flowed from her lips like water from a mountain spring, perfect and natural and impossible. She spoke of peace, of shared hunger, of children who needed their fathers to return home safely. Her voice carried the formal cadences of council meetings, but underneath ran something warmer, the tone of someone speaking to family, to people whose stories lived in her bones. The Apache warriors stared at her with the same confusion Nailnish felt clawing at his chest. One of them, barely more than a boy, with the fierce pride of youth burning in his dark eyes, slid from his horse and approached the garden fence. "Who taught you our words?" "White woman," he demanded, and his voice carried both suspicion and something that might have been hope. Sarah's hand went unconsciously to her throat, where no jewelry hung, but where the gesture suggested she once wore something precious. "A grandmother," she said quietly in Apache. "A woman who called me Siyala, Little Star." The name hit Nailnish like a war club to the chest. He gripped the pine trunk beside him, bark biting into his palms as memory crashed through him like a flash flood through a dry canyon. A pale child running through his grandmother's camp, laughing as she chased prairie dogs, and spoke Apache with the fluid grace of someone born to the language. Hair like sunlight, eyes the color of desert sky, small hands always reaching for his own. "Shuri," she had called him. "My brother." But that child was dead. Had been dead for 15 winters, taken by cavalry raids that scattered his band like leaves before a storm. Nailnish had seen the blue soldiers ride away, with a screaming white girl thrown across a horse like a sack of grain, had heard her cries fade into the distance until they became another ghost voice haunting the desert wind. Yet here stood a woman who called herself by that lost child's name, who moved like desert wind and sang his grandmother's songs. The young Apache warrior was speaking again, but his hostility had transformed into something more complex. Curiosity mixed with the pain that Nailnish recognized as the same confusion tearing at his own heart. Siyala was lost, the warrior said carefully, taken by soldiers when we were children. If you are she, then you know the name of the woman who raised you after your blood family died. Sarah's face went white as winter clouds. Her hand pressed harder against her throat, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of 15 years' worth of carefully buried Grandmother Nashone, she whispered, she who walks with wisdom. She sang to me when the nightmares came. She taught me that corn pollen scattered at dawn brings blessing to the new day. Sarah's voice broke, and tears tracked through the dust on her cheeks like small rivers carving new paths through drought-hardened earth. The young warrior's painted face crumpled. Siyala, he breathed, and the name held so much tenderness that watching settlers began to lower their rifles, sensing that something sacred was unfolding before them. From his place among the pines, Nailnish felt his own heart breaking and mending simultaneously. The lost child had been found, but she wore the face of a stranger, spoke with the voice of someone who had learned to live between worlds without truly belonging to either. The reunion below was brief. The Apache warriors could not linger. Safety lay in movement, in staying ahead of the cavalry patrols that hunted them like wolves. But before they left, the young warrior pressed something into Sarah's hands, a small bundle wrapped in soft deerskin. "From your Apache mother," he said gently. She kept these, hoping someday. Sarah unwrapped the bundle with trembling fingers. Inside lay treasures from a childhood she had been forced to bury. A corn husk doll with hair of black horsehair, a necklace of turquoise and silver, and a photograph, cracked and faded, showing an Apache woman holding a pale child on her lap, both faces bright with love that transcended the boundaries of blood and skin. "Tell her," Sarah whispered in Apache, "tell her that Siyala thinks of her every sunrise. Tell her that some lessons cannot be forgotten, even when the world demands we pretend they never were." The warriors mounted their horses and disappeared into the heat shimmer of the desert, leaving Sarah standing in her garden with tears falling on his sacred objects she had thought lost forever. The settlers emerged from their hiding places, chattering with nervous relief and asking questions she could not answer without revealing truths that would make her life impossible. But Nailnish, watching from his ridge, understood everything. The pale child who had once called him brother had grown into a woman caught between worlds, teaching white children their letters while Apache words lived like caged birds in her heart. She had survived the impossible, being torn from one family and forced into another, learning to hide her true self so completely that even she had almost forgotten who she really was. As sunset painted the desert in shades of copper and gold, Nailnish made a decision that would change both their lives forever. He would find a way to speak with her, to bridge the gap between the child she had been and the woman she had become. He would discover if the girl who once called him brother still lived somewhere behind those desert blue eyes. The desert wind carried the scent of sage and distant rain, and somewhere in its whispered song, Nailnish thought he could hear his grandmother's voice reminding him that some bonds are stronger than time, than loss, than all the forces that try to tear families apart. Some bonds, once forged in love, can survive even the longest winter. That night, as Sarah held her recovered treasures by lamplight, she whispered Apache prayers she thought she had forgotten. Miles away, on a ridge overlooking the settlement, Nailnish dreamed of a laughing child who had once shared his grandmother's fire, and woke with tears on his face and the absolute certainty that tomorrow he would find the courage to speak the name that had haunted him for 15 years. Sarah McKenna had not slept since the Apache warriors visited her garden. For 3 nights, she sat by her window with the recovered treasures spread before her like pieces of a broken mirror, each fragment reflecting a different version of herself. The corn husk doll with its horsehair braids. The turquoise necklace that had once hung around her neck as she learned to grind corn and track deer. The photograph of Nashone, her Apache mother, whose weathered hands had braided her hair each morning and whose lullabies had chased away nightmares born of her first family's violent death. She was studying the photograph when a soft knock came at her door. It was barely dawn, the desert still wrapped in the blue-gray silence that preceded sunrise. No settler would call at such an hour. There were people of schedules and propriety, who announced their visits and respected the boundaries between day and night. But this knock carried a different rhythm, patient and respectful, like someone who understood that some conversations required the sanctuary of early morning quiet. Sarah opened the door and found herself looking into the eyes that had haunted her dreams for 15 years. He stood in the pre-dawn shadows, tall and lean as desert pine, his presence filling the doorway without blocking the light. His long black hair was loose around his shoulders, and he wore simple clothes, leather pants, a cotton shirt, moccasins that had walked countless miles over stone and sand. But it was his eyes that made her breath catch, dark as obsidian, warm as banked fires, and filled with the same gentle patience she remembered from a childhood that felt both impossibly distant and heartbreakingly near. "Cherie," she whispered, the word escaping her lips like a prayer. "My brother." "Siyala," he answered, and the sound of her Apache name in his voice broke something open in her chest, something that had been locked away for so long she had forgotten it could still feel. They stood there in the doorway, separated by 3 feet of morning air and 15 years of forced forgetting, each afraid that speaking might shatter the miracle of this moment. Sarah's hand gripped the door frame so tightly her knuckles went white, anchoring herself against the tide of memory and emotion that threatened to sweep her away. "You remember," she said finally, and her voice was barely more than desert wine through sage. "I never forgot." Nailnish stepped closer, and she could see the years mapped across his face, lines carved by sun and sorrow, a scar along his jawline that spoke of battles fought and survived. "Even when they told me you were gone forever, part of me kept listening for your voice in the wind." Sarah felt tears burning behind her eyes. "They said I had to forget. The missionaries, the teachers, the families who tried to make me white again. They said remembering would only bring pain." And did it bring pain? The question hung between them, like smoke from a dying fire. Sarah looked past him to the desert that stretched endless and unchanging beyond Socorro's small circle of human ambition. Out there, Apache bands still moved like ghosts across ancestral lands, still fought their hopeless war against an enemy that outnumbered them like stars outnumber candles. Out there, cavalry patrols hunted her adopted brother's people with the same relentless efficiency they used to hunt wolves. "Every day," she whispered. "Every single day for 15 years. Nailnish nodded as if he had expected this answer. "May I come in?" "There are things we must speak of, but not where curious eyes can see." Sarah stepped aside, and he entered her small sanctuary, the room where she planned lessons and corrected papers, where she lived the careful life of a frontier schoolteacher who had learned to hide the deepest parts of herself behind a mask of respectability. He looked around with the observant eyes of someone who had learned to read stories in small details. The Apache blanket folded carefully in a wooden chest, the desert plants growing in clay pots by the window, the way her few books were arranged with the same precision his grandmother had used to organize her medicine bundles. "You kept pieces," he said, and she heard approval in his voice. "Even when they tried to make you forget everything." "I had to." Sarah closed the door and turned to face him, this ghost made flesh, this brother who had grown into a man while she learned to pretend she was someone else. "Without them, I would have disappeared entirely. Become just another white woman who never existed before she arrived in Socorro." Nailnish picked up the corn husk doll from her table, cradling it in his large hands with the gentleness she remembered from their childhood. "Grandmother made this for you after the nightmares started. You used to hold it and tell it stories in Apache until you fell asleep." The memory hit her like lightning. Being small and terrified in Apache Lodge, surrounded by people who spoke in musical syllables she didn't understand, grieving for parents whose faces were already fading like smoke. And then Nazhon's warm hands placing the doll in her arms, Nailnish's young voice teaching her the words for safe and family and home. "I remember," Sarah said, and the words opened floodgates that had been sealed for too long. "I remember all of it. Learning to braid leather and identify healing plants. The way the whole camp smelled like wood smoke and sage. How you taught me to track rabbits, and your grandmother taught me to sing corn into growing. I remember feeling like I belonged somewhere for the first time since my birth family died. Nailnish set down the doll and turned to face her fully. In the growing morning light, she could see the boy she had known in the plains of his adult face, but overlaid now with the weight of years that had changed them both in ways that could never be undone. And I remember the morning the cavalry came, he said quietly. How you fought them when they tried to take you. How you screamed my name in Apache as they rode away. Sarah closed her eyes against the memory, but it came anyway. Blue uniforms and brass buttons and horses' hooves churning dust into choking clouds. Hands that grabbed her with no gentleness. Voices that spoke of rescuing her from savages who had given her the only real home she had ever known. The way Nailnish had tried to run after them, only to be held back by adults who understood that following meant death. They said I was being saved, she whispered. They said living with Apache had damaged me, made me forget my true nature. They spent 2 years trying to beat the Indian out of me. Did they succeed? Sarah opened her eyes and looked at this man who carried her childhood in his heart, who had grown up to be a warrior in a war she could not take sides in without destroying herself. No, she said simply. They taught me to hide it better, that's all. I learned to speak English without an accent, to move like white women move, to want the things white women are supposed to want. But inside I stayed Siyala. I stayed your Shress. The Apache word for sister hung in the air between them, and suddenly the careful distance they had been maintaining collapsed like a dam after spring floods. Nailnish stepped forward, and Sarah moved to meet him, and then they were holding each other with the fierce desperation of people who had been torn apart and never expected to be whole again. He smelled like sage and leather and the particular dusty sweetness of desert wind. She could feel the solid warmth of him, the steady rhythm of his breathing, the way his hands tangled in her hair as if trying to convince himself she was real. For a moment that stretched like sunlight across water, they were children again, 2 lost souls who had found family in each other when the world offered them nothing but sorrow. But they were not children anymore. This is impossible, Sarah whispered against his shoulder. You know that, don't you? A white woman and an Apache warrior, in a world where your people and mine are killing each other over every scrap of land and water and future. Nailnish pulled back to look at her, his hand still framing her face as if she were something precious that might disappear if he loosened his grip. My people, he said carefully, are not the ones who put you in classrooms and told you to forget your real family. My people are not the ones who made you choose between 2 halves of your heart, but they're the ones the settlers fear, the ones the cavalry hunts. And I am the one who teaches their children, who lives among them, who depends on their acceptance for survival. Sarah's voice broke on the last word. I cannot love you without betraying everything I've built here. And you cannot love me without betraying everything you fight for. Nailnish was quiet for a long moment, his thumb tracing the curve of her cheek with infinite tenderness. Outside, Socorro was waking up. She could hear the familiar sounds of morning routines, of a community beginning another day in the strange borderland between civilization and wilderness. Perhaps, he said finally, the problem is not that we love each other. Perhaps the problem is a world that demands we choose sides in a war neither of us wanted. Sarah leaned into his touch, memorizing the feel of his skin against hers, the way morning light caught in his dark eyes. What are you saying? I'm saying that love like ours, love that crosses bloodlines and survives separation and grows stronger in the face of impossibility, the kind of love doesn't ask permission from the world. It simply is. And where does that leave us? Nailnish smiled, and in that smile, Sarah saw the boy who had once shared his grandmother's fire with a lost white child, who had taught her that family was something you chose rather than something you inherited. It leaves us here, he said simply, in this moment, with this truth between us, and with the choice to honor what we are to each other, even if we can never have what the world says we should want. As the sun rose fully over Socorro, painting the desert in shades of gold and hope, Sarah and Nailnish stood together in the space between worlds. Two souls who had found each other again across an ocean of loss and impossibility. They knew their love story could never have a traditional ending, but perhaps that was not the point. Perhaps the point was simply that love existed, fierce and true and uncompromising, even in a world determined to tear it apart. The dust cloud appeared on the horizon 3 days after Nailnish and Sarah's reunion, spreading across the desert floor like spilled blood under the merciless New Mexico sun. From her schoolhouse window, Sarah watched it grow larger, more ominous, carrying within its churning darkness the promise of violence that had been building like summer thunder for weeks. "Apache war party," whispered Tom Bradley, the telegraph operator who had burst into her classroom with sweat streaming down his face and terror bright in his eyes. 50 warriors, maybe more. And there's cavalry riding hard from Fort Craig, trying to get here first. Sarah's students, 23 children who had learned their letters under her patient guidance, looked up from their slates with the wide, frightened eyes of prairie creatures sensing predators. She could see their fathers' faces and their expressions, the same mixture of fear and determination that frontier families wore like armor against an unforgiving world. "Children," she said quietly, her voice carrying the calm authority that had kept them safe through dust storms and flash floods and the 100 small catastrophes that mark frontier life. "Please gather your things and go home to your families. School is dismissed for today." They moved like shadows, these children who had learned too young that survival sometimes meant running. But 8-year-old Lucy Martinez lingered at her desk, her small dark eyes fixed on Sarah's face with an intensity that made the teacher's heart clench. "Miss McKenna," Lucy whispered, "are you going to run too?" The question hit Sarah like a physical blow. Everyone else would run. The merchants would board up their shops. The families would barricade themselves in their homes. The men would gather with rifles and wait for the killing to begin. It was the pattern of frontier life. Fear meeting fear, violence begetting violence, until the desert sand was darkened with blood from both sides. But Sarah McKenna was not everyone else. "No, sweetheart," she said, kneeling to meet Lucy's eyes. "I'm going to stay right here." As the last child disappeared down Socorro's dusty main street, Sarah stood alone in her schoolhouse, surrounded by the tools of her trade. Chalk and slate, books and benches, the simple implements she used to build bridges between ignorance and understanding. Outside, the two dust clouds drew closer. Apache warriors from the south, cavalry from the north, like opposing storm fronts that would collide with Socorro caught helplessly in between. She was still standing there when Nailnish appeared at her window, moving with the silent grace that had once made him the finest scout in his grandmother's band. "You have to leave," he said without preamble. "Both armies think this town is enemy territory. When they meet, there will be no safety for anyone caught between them." Sarah turned to face him, this man who carried her heart and her childhood in his dark eyes, this warrior who had chosen love over loyalty to his own people's war. "I can't leave. Siyala, no." She stepped closer to the window, close enough to touch his face through the opening if she had been brave enough to reach across the space between them. "Don't you see? This is why we found each other again. This is why the spirits brought us together after 15 years of separation." Nailnish's expression grew still, the way it had when they were children and he was trying to understand one of her more complicated ideas. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that love like ours, love that crosses bloodlines and survives impossible odds, maybe that love exists for a reason." Sarah's voice grew stronger as the truth crystallized in her mind. "Maybe we're supposed to be the bridge." Outside, the sound of approaching hoofbeats grew louder, accompanied by the war cries and bugle calls that had become the soundtrack of territorial violence. But Sarah felt a strange calm settling over her, the same peaceful certainty that had once come to her during Apache ceremonies when the whole world seemed to align itself around a single, perfect truth. "You're talking about standing between two armies," Nailnish said quietly. "You're talking about trying to stop a war. I'm talking about speaking words that both sides can understand. About being the voice that says family is stronger than fear, that humanity is bigger than the color of our skin. Sarah picked up the eagle feather he had left on her desk after saving her from the bandits, the symbol of protection and blessing that now seemed like a promise from the desert spirits themselves. I'm talking about doing what my grandmother Nashon taught me, that sometimes the most important battles are fought with words, not weapons. Nailnish was quiet for a long moment, his eyes reflecting the same internal struggle she had wrestled with for 3 days. Then his face transformed, and Sarah saw in his expression the same certainty that filled her own heart. "Then we do this together," he said simply. The Apache war party reached Socorro first, their horses lathered with sweat and their painted faces grim with the weight of too many losses. Sarah recognized their leader, Mongas, a young chief whose band had been driven from their traditional hunting grounds by expanding cattle ranches and broken treaties. His eyes held the desperate fury of a man who had nothing left to lose. Sarah walked out to meet them in the middle of Socorro's main street, with Nailnish beside her and the morning sun casting long shadows across the dusty ground. The townspeople watched from behind barricaded windows, their rifles glinting in the harsh light, their fear so thick it seemed to shimmer in the desert air. "Mongas," Sarah called in perfect Chiricahua Apache, her voice carrying across the silent street with the formal cadences of council speech. "I would speak with you of peace." The young chief's painted face showed surprise, then suspicion. "You are the white woman who speaks our tongue. The one my warriors told me about." His horse pranced nervously, sensing its rider's tension. "Why do you stand between us and our enemies?" "Because some of these enemies are also my family," Sarah replied, gesturing toward the watching townspeople. "And because some of you are also my family." She looked directly at Nailnish, letting her love for him show clearly in her expression. "I am Siyala, daughter of Nashon, sister to this warrior who stands beside me. I have lived in both worlds, and I tell you that neither side wins when children die for the hatred of their elders." Mongas's eyes narrowed, but she could see interest flickering behind his war paint. "What do you propose, daughter of two worlds?" Before Sarah could answer, the cavalry arrived in a thunder of hoofbeats and jangling equipment. Captain Morrison, a career soldier whose weathered face had seen too many frontier conflicts, rode at their head with a saber drawn and his men arranged in battle formation behind him. "Stand aside, ma'am," he barked at Sarah. "These hostiles have been raiding settlements throughout the territory. We're here to put an end to their depredations." "Captain Morrison," Sarah said, switching to English, but keeping her voice pitched to carry to both groups. "These warriors are not here to raid. They're here because their families are starving, because their traditional hunting grounds have been taken, because they have nowhere else to turn." "That's not my concern," Morrison replied curtly. "My orders are to pacify this territory by whatever means necessary." Sarah felt the moment balanced on a knife's edge. Behind Morrison, 40 cavalry soldiers sat ready to charge. Facing them, 50 Apache warriors gripped their weapons with the desperate courage of men fighting for their people's survival. Between them stood a schoolteacher and a warrior, two souls bound by love, but separated by everything their respective worlds demanded they believe. "Then let me give you a different concern," Sarah said, her voice ringing across the tense silence. "Let me tell you about Lucy Martinez, 8 years old, whose Apache grandmother taught her to weave baskets. Let me tell you about Johnny Wilson, whose father trades fairly with Apache bands when the army isn't watching. Let me tell you about families on both sides who just want their children to grow up in a world where speaking different languages doesn't mean you have to be enemies." She stepped forward, placing herself directly between the two armed forces, and felt Nailnish move with her. Together, they stood in the space where violence was supposed to happen, their bodies forming a bridge between worlds that had forgotten how to see each other's humanity. "I have lived as Apache," Sarah continued, her words carrying to every listening ear. "I have lived as white. I have been daughter to both peoples, and I tell you that the blood that flows in all our veins is the same color. The tears we cry for our lost children taste the same. The love we feel for our families burns with the same fire. Captain Morrison's saber wavered. In the Apache ranks, warriors began to lower their weapons. Something was shifting in the terrible mathematics of violence, some equation being rebalanced by the simple presence of two people who refused to choose sides in a war that had already cost too much. "What are you asking?" Mongus said quietly. Sarah looked at him, then at Captain Morrison, then at the faces watching from windows and doorways, settlers and soldiers, children and grandmothers, all of them caught in a web of fear and misunderstanding that had been generations in the weaving. "I'm asking you to remember that enemies are just people whose stories we haven't bothered to learn," she said. "I'm asking you to see that the real victory isn't in defeating each other. It's in building something better for the children who will inherit this land after we're gone." The silence stretched like desert horizon, vast and pregnant with possibility. Then Mongus slid from his horse and walked forward, his war paint gleaming in the harsh sun. He stopped directly in front of Sarah and extended his hand, not in surrender, but in recognition. "Siyala," he said formally, "daughter of two worlds, speaker of truth. If there is to be peace, let begin with this moment." Captain Morrison hesitated, clearly torn between his orders and the strange magic that was transforming a battlefield into something unprecedented. Finally, slowly, he sheathed his saber and dismounted. What followed was not the massacre that everyone had expected, but something far more dangerous and far more powerful: conversation. Translator by translator, word by careful word, Sarah and Nailnish helped two groups of enemies discover that they were all just people trying to survive in a hard land, trying to protect their families, trying to build something lasting in the face of an uncertain future. By sunset, they had negotiated something that wasn't quite peace, but wasn't war either, a fragile understanding that would need to be rebuilt every day, but that offered the possibility of tomorrow being different from yesterday. As the cavalry and the Apache warriors departed in opposite directions, Sarah and Nailnish stood alone in Socorro's main street, exhausted and exhilarated and forever changed by what they had witnessed. "It won't last," Nailnish said quietly. "There are too many people on both sides who profit from hatred." "Maybe not," Sarah agreed. "But today it lasted. Today, children on both sides will sleep safely in their beds. And maybe that's enough." Nailnish turned to face her, his eyes reflecting the first stars appearing in the desert sky. "And what about us? What happens to the warrior and the schoolteacher who love each other across enemy lines?" Sarah smiled, feeling a peace settle over her that had nothing to do with the day's victory and everything to do with the man standing beside her. "We do what we did today. We choose love over fear, understanding over hatred, bridge building over wall building. We may never be able to share a life together the way other couples do, but we can share a purpose. Building bridges? Building bridges," she confirmed. "Teaching children on both sides that their humanity is bigger than their differences. Showing the world that love is stronger than the forces that try to divide us." Nailnish reached for her hand, and she let him take it, their fingers intertwining like rivers meeting after long separation. "Then let us build bridges, Siyala. Let us show this hard world what happens when people choose love instead of war." Above them, the desert stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, indifferent to human conflict but witness to human love. And in the space between worlds, a warrior and a schoolteacher made a promise that would echo through generations. That some bonds are stronger than bloodline, that some truths transcend the color of skin, that some loves are powerful enough to change the world. One bridge, one conversation, one moment of understanding at a time. The desert wind whispered secrets through the sage, carrying their promise into the vast night, where it joined the eternal song of all those who choose hope over hatred, love over fear, and tomorrow over yesterday. Years later, the children of Socorro would tell their own children about the day a white schoolteacher and an Apache warrior stood between two armies and chose love instead of war. They would say it was just a story, just a legend born from desert dust and frontier dreams. But those who knew how to listen would hear the truth echoing in the wind, that some bridges, once built, become paths that others can follow toward a better world.